Hey guys, tonight we're plunging into the nightmarish fever dream of Victorian England, a time so strange and uptight that even the ghosts wore corsets and argued about etiquette. But forget all the usual Dickensian gloom. Tonight is all about the weirdest, wildest, and honestly deadliest tradition the Victorians ever invented. Halloween pranks. Yes, pranks. As in, haha, got you. Only this is 19th century England, so you know someone's probably getting scarred for life. And the only treat is the relief of not waking up as a cautionary tale in a penny dreadful. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this. Seriously, if you've ever accidentally set off your smoke alarm trying to reheat pizza, you'll fit right in. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and if your neighbors have ever tried to murder you with a festive prank. Dim those lights, turn on a fan for maximum haunted Victorian ambience, and burrow deep into whatever pillow fort you've constructed to avoid the spectre of your to-do list. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how Halloween got so weird? Did Victorians actually bob for apples, or just invent new ways to accidentally poison their neighbors? Why did everyone suddenly become obsessed with fake ghosts, explosive flour, and horse skeletons? How did people survive when the average prank involved gunpowder, stolen coffins, and the sort of trauma that even modern HR departments would struggle to categorize? And most importantly, could you have survived a single night of festive fun in a world where trick-or-treating meant risking actual trickery, real injuries, and a 90% chance of catching tuberculosis from a papier-mâché mask? Congratulations, you've just woken up in London, 1872. It's Halloween. Your landlord is convinced he's being haunted by a tap-dancing poltergeist. The children next door have filled your mailbox with dead frogs, and the air smells like coal smoke and mild regret. Good luck. Halloween arrives in Victorian England like a fever. An imported holiday that quickly mutates from quiet rural folk customs into a full-on urban panic. Suddenly, everyone from chimney sweeps to duchesses is competing to out-scare, out-weird, and occasionally out-injure each other, because nothing says holiday spirit like staging a séance for your boss or filling your neighbor's stovepipe with gunpowder. Let's set the scene. It's the 1870s. London's streets are draped in that classic, cozy combination of pea, soup fog, and horse manure. The only thing thicker than the air is the tension, because you never know if you're about to be handed a turnip lantern or accidentally enrolled in a surprise ghost hunt. Victorians aren't satisfied with a simple night of bobbing for apples and telling mildly unsettling stories. No, they want to turn Halloween into the Olympics of anxiety. And you, my friend, have just been signed up for every event. At the root of this obsession is a cocktail of boredom, competition, and a dash of morbid curiosity. Most Victorians have a daily life that's about as exciting as a 3-day porridge. Work, church, work, tea, and more work. Halloween, with its imported promise of mischief and the supernatural, becomes the social release valve. For once, it's not just socially acceptable to make your neighbors jump out of their skin, it's encouraged. The whole town joins in, from the gentry plotting candlelit terror in drawing rooms to street kids pelting pedestrians with cabbages like pint-sized anarchists. But this isn't the Halloween you know today, with cute costumes and fun-sized candy bars. No, this is Halloween in an age when the scariest thing most people had seen was a medical pamphlet or the inside of a public toilet. Victorians are inventing what it means to be spooked. Suddenly, you're seeing advertisements for ghost tours, séances held in respectable parlors, and etiquette guides for how to react if you're haunted by your own furniture. Spiritualism is the TikTok trend of the era. Everyone's got a friend who knows a medium, or at least a cousin who claims to have been chased by a phantom goose. It's not just about spirits and séances, though. Victorians turn everything into a competition. Who can carve the most terrifying root vegetable? Who can invent the most elaborate ghost story? Who can prank the butcher so badly that he's still telling the story at Christmas? The answer is everyone, and all at once. If you're lucky, your biggest scare is a grinning turnip with a candle inside. If you're less lucky, you're the subject of a headline in the Times. Respectable banker found covered in flour, claims spectral sabotage. Let's talk about those pranks for a second. Ever found your front door jammed shut by a wedge of lard? Welcome to Halloween. Open your mailbox to find it full of sawdust and feathers? That's just the warm-up act. Someone has probably swapped your boots for a pair full of molasses. And there's a 50-50 chance your garden gate will end up on the church roof by morning. The Victorians don't do anything halfway, and when it comes to Halloween, the line between prank and public menace is about as thin as the average moustache. Of course, it's not just about terrorizing the neighbors. Halloween is also an excuse for parties. If by party, you mean cramming 24 people into a smoke-filled parlor, telling each other the most elaborate lies possible, and pretending not to notice that someone's pet ferret is loose under the sideboard. Parlor games become more devious, too. There's the classic bite the apple off the string, but also blindfolded room navigation, impromptu treasure hunts, and the infamous donut on a string, which is mostly an excuse for adults to watch each other flail and laugh so hard their corsets threaten to give up. By the end of the night, everyone's slightly sticky, mildly traumatized, and already planning how to one-up each other next year. You go to bed with the lingering suspicion that your coat may contain a live frog, and you'll never look at a turnip the same way again. Congratulations. You've survived the great Victorian Halloween craze. Just remember, if your windows rattle tonight, it's probably the wind, or possibly a highly competitive duchess with a new prank to test. Either way, you might want to sleep with one eye open. Forget your Instagram-ready pumpkins. The Victorians carved their jacko, lanterns out of turnips, mangel-wurzels, and anything vaguely root-shaped. Imagine walking down a foggy London street and locking eyes with a demonically grinning rutabaga. That's Victorian Halloween decor for you. Nightmare fuel and an excellent source of vitamin C. Let's be clear. If you're picturing picturesque orange pumpkins glowing softly on every stoop, you are not in 19th century England. For one thing, pumpkins were mostly livestock feed, or worse, a suspicious American import. A pumpkin, in a Victorian garden, was a sign you'd lost control of your vegetables and possibly your morals. So the job of scaring off evil spirits, and, more importantly, neighborhood children, fell to whatever you could dig out of the mud that October, turnips, beets, parsnips, or, if you really wanted to show off, a massive mangel-wurzel roughly the size and density of a bowling ball. Now, carving these vegetables wasn't just about making something spooky for your windowsill. It was an act of survival, stubbornness, and frankly, frustration. The average turnip in Victorian England was about as easy to carve as a small boulder and required roughly the same amount of upper body strength. Children were sent into the yard with a dull knife and a warning, "Don't come back until it looks frightening." The result? Jagged, misshapen grimaces that looked less like playful mischief and more like they'd crawled out of the earth to whisper secrets to your nightmares. And the effect, oh, the effect. Picture it. A chilly autumn evening, mist rolling in over cobblestone streets, gas lamps flickering, and the distant echo of horse hooves. Suddenly, out of the gloom, a rotten turnip with hollowed eyes and a deranged grin glares up from a fence post. It's less festive and more "I need an adult." Even the bravest stray dog would think twice before sniffing around a Victorian jack-o'-lantern. Of course, these root vegetables weren't just random. Each one had a purpose rooted, pun intended, in folklore. People believed that carving a face into a turnip would ward off evil spirits. Especially the sort of spirits who got a little too excited on All Hallows' Eve. Some even claimed the lanterns would keep away fairies, witches, or anyone with the audacity to show up without an invitation. In reality, it mostly kept away people with good taste in home decor. And the practicality of these lanterns? questionable at best. A hollowed-out turnip isn't what you'd call a roomy vessel. You'd jam a stubby candle, or, if you were unlucky, a burning coal inside, and the resulting light was somewhere between ambiance and open flame insurance claim. There's a good chance you'd set your own sleeve on fire before anyone was actually spooked by the lantern. The smell, an unforgettable blend of scorched root vegetable and tallow, hung in the air, adding yet another layer to the already fragrant London fog. But the Victorians were nothing if not competitive. Households vied to outdo one another in their vegetable artistry. Some carved elaborate teeth. Others went for simple horror. The truly ambitious attached hair made of straw gave their lanterns button eyes, or painted them with soot for added terror. If your lantern lasted more than one night before collapsing in on itself and oozing across the stoop, you were basically the Martha Stewart of 1872. Don't forget, the lantern wasn't just for looking at, it was for parading around the neighborhood, especially if you were a child hoping to extort a treat, or at least a slightly less rotten apple, from your neighbors. Imagine running around with a turnip lantern swinging from a string, giggling with friends, and hoping you didn't get whacked by a cabbage in return. It was the height of Halloween sophistication. So next time you see a perfectly carved pumpkin glowing on someone's porch, remember the Victorian children and their haunted vegetables. They didn't have Instagram, but they had plenty of courage and forearms like blacksmiths. You haven't known fear until you've stared into the flickering grin of a half-rotten Swede on a foggy night, wondering if it's going to ward off evil or just give you indigestion. That's the real spirit of Victorian Halloween. A little ingenuity, a lot of stubbornness, and enough root vegetables to haunt your dreams. The Victorian version of apple bobbing wasn't just a light-hearted game, it was more like competitive, near drowning. Children dunked their faces into buckets of water, while adults egged them on, occasionally adding coins, frogs, or the odd eel for variety. Fun for the whole family, if you don't mind the risk of hypothermia and lifelong mistrust of fruit. Let's set the scene. It's Halloween night. You're squeezed into a tiny parlor, the air thick with coal smoke, sweat, and the aroma of boiled cabbage. There's a roaring fire, which is less cozy and more safety hazard, and a bucket of suspiciously murky water placed front and center. It's apple bobbing time, which in Victorian England is the social equivalent of a group trust fall, except you're trusting a rusty pail, some questionably clean apples, and your own lung capacity. You, a small, shivering Victorian child, are volunteered first. The rules are simple. Hands behind your back, face into the water, and don't come up until you've got an apple, or, preferably, a good story about your brush with the afterlife. The adults watch with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for public executions, occasionally helping by spinning the bucket or tossing in a handful of coppers for added challenge. Did we mention the water hasn't been changed since last year's party? Bonus points if you surface with anything that wasn't in there at the start of the night. As the evening progresses, so does the competitive spirit. It's not enough to just grab an apple, no, you're encouraged to come up with two, or to race the neighbor's kid to see who can drown more fashionably. The more enterprising prankster might sneak in a live frog, or, in certain rural parts, an actual eel, just to liven things up. Imagine the shock when your bite lands not on a Braeburn, but on something slippery and wriggling. Nothing says holiday magic like the sound of shrieking children and the thud of a startled eel slapping the parlor rug. And of course, this being Victorian England, health and safety are little more than vague rumors. The fire roars dangerously close to the splash zone. The adults are preoccupied with their punch, possibly spiked with a medicinal dose of brandy. And the floor is already slick with muddy footprints and apple peelings. The room echoes with laughter, coughing, and the occasional gasp for air as a child emerges, victorious but soaked, hair plastered their forehead, and eyes wide with a combination of triumph and mild trauma. Not to be outdone, the adults sometimes get in on the act. After all, nothing builds Victorian character quite like watching your father attempt to submerge his mutton chops in a bucket. The stakes for adults are higher: pride, reputation, and the ever-present risk of losing a false tooth. Apple bobbing turns into a gladiatorial sport, one that tests your ability to hold your breath, avoid inhaling most of the Thames, and emerge with at least one molar intact. But the games don't stop at bobbing. The Victorians are inventive. There's snap apple, where apples, and sometimes candles, yes, lit candles, are suspended from the ceiling on strings. You're blindfolded, spun around, and then encouraged to catch the apple with your teeth, all while avoiding the flame. It's like a carnival game invented by someone with a grudge against dental work. Inevitably, someone ends up with a mouthful of hot wax and a story to tell at every family gathering for the next decade. For many children, these games are a rite of passage. Survive the night without swallowing a coin, eating a frog, or setting yourself on fire, and you've earned your place in Victorian society. Congratulations! You'll never trust a bowl of fruit salad again. By the end of the night, the parlor looks like a shipwreck. Everyone's soaked, someone's crying, and you're left with a powerful lesson. Fun is relative, and sometimes surviving the party is victory enough. And if you wake up with a sore throat and a newfound phobia of apples, well, welcome to Victorian Halloween, where every game is a little too real, and the only real treat is living to play another round next year. Victorian Mischief Night makes modern toilet papering look like amateur hour. From soaping doorknobs to hoisting farmers' carts onto rooftops, pranks escalated into full-on property damage. If you ever wondered what Victorian kids did before TikTok, the answer is petty vandalism and occasional arson. Let's start with the basics. Mischief Night, also known as Goosey Night, Devil's Night, or just that night when the town goes slightly feral, wasn't limited to kids sneaking around after dark. This was an all-ages, full community effort. Pranks weren't just tolerated, they were expected. It was the one night a year when you could get away with things that, on any other evening, would have you hauled before a magistrate, or at the very least, yelled at by Mrs. Crumple from next door. The classic Mischief Night starter pack included soap for windows and door handles, string for tying together anything that wasn't nailed down, and the omnipresent sack of flour. There's nothing quite like waking up to find your entire stoop has been dusted like a particularly bland cake. And if you think that's mild, remember, the Victorians invented escalation. First, it's a little soap on the doorknob. Next, you're trying to coax your pig out of the church belfry, because some aspiring engineer with too much free time and access to a pulley system has decided gravity is just a suggestion. Hoisting carts onto rooftops wasn't an urban legend. It was an actual event carried out by determined pranksters with enough energy to fuel a small textile mill. Picture this. You're a respectable farmer. You've worked a 14-hour day. You finally crawl into bed, and you wake up to discover your two-wheeled cart perched atop the village bakery, surrounded by cheering children and a couple of sheep who look suspiciously complicit. No one is quite sure how it was done, and the townsfolk don't ask questions they don't want answers to. Just know that what goes up must eventually come down, usually with a loud crash and a stern letter to the local paper. Mischief Night was about more than inconvenience. It was about creativity. Some pranksters took it as a personal challenge to outdo themselves every year. They swapped shop signs, so the butcher became the baker became the undertaker, and everyone spent the next morning hopelessly lost and deeply suspicious of their sausage rolls. Garden gates would disappear, only to be found days later hanging from the church steeple or barricading the vicarage privy. Even the town statues weren't safe. A favourite move was to give them accessories. A mop wig here, a false mustache there, and, if you were really ambitious, a carefully balanced chamber pot. Of course, with all this mischief came the risk of, well, chaos. The line between prank and crime was thin, and the Victorians hopped over it with both feet. A little too much enthusiasm, a bit too much homemade gunpowder, and suddenly the town square had an exciting new skylight. The authorities tried to keep up, posting constables, issuing warnings and threatening dire consequences. But on mischief night, the odds were against them. After all, how do you chase down pranksters when half the town is in on the joke and the other half is just trying to avoid being the next victim? It wasn't just kids and farmhands. Adults got in on the fun, especially after a pint or two. Mischief night became a bonding experience, a way to let off steam, mock authority, and just maybe get revenge for a neighbour's noisy rooster or last year's stolen turnips. For one glorious evening, hierarchy broke down. The local squire's gates ended up in the pond. Schoolmaster's outhouse moved 3 gardens over, and even the mayor wasn't safe from the occasional well-placed dead fish. By dawn, the evidence of mischief night was everywhere. Feathered streets, swapped signs, missing livestock, and more than a few hangovers. The pranksters, victorious and only mildly bruised, slunk home to their beds, already plotting next year's improvements. And the victims? They muttered, they cleaned up, and, secretly, they admired the audacity. Because deep down, everyone knew that mischief night wasn't just about chaos. It was about community. It was about laughter in the darkness, surprise where you least expected it, and the shared understanding that sometimes a little mischief is the best way to survive another year in a world full of rules. So if you ever wonder how Victorian England coped with long winters, strict social codes, and the crushing weight of boredom, just remember, sometimes all you need is a bar of soap, a bucket of flour, and a very forgiving neighbour. The phrase DIY costume had real teeth in the 1800s. With fire-hazardous fabrics, coal dust, and a dash of lead paint, the average Halloween costume was equal parts festive and flammable. Nothing completes a spooky ensemble like a mask that both suffocates you and doubles as a chemical weapon. Let's get ready for the annual Victorian Costume Parade, also known as Survival of the Flammable. First, you rummage through the family rag bag, which is less wardrobe and more historical archive of stains. There are your options: a burlap sack that smells like onions, a moth-eaten shawl, and something that used to be curtains but is now mostly holes and regrets. The good news: it's all natural fiber. The bad news: it's also the favorite snack of every stray spark within a 5-mile radius. Next, you begin assembly. The true mark of a Victorian Halloween is the costume mask, a work of art held together with string, hope, and the adhesive power of Victorian-era paste, which incidentally might also be a major food group if you're unlucky. You're encouraged to get creative: coal dust for shading, shoe polish for mystery, and nothing says ghoulish glamour like a face full of white lead paint. If you survive the night, your skin will never look the same, and you'll be peeling black crust out of your nostrils for a fortnight. The mask itself is a masterpiece. Some are carved out of thick, unbreathable papier-mâché, molded by hand over a cabbage, or, if you're really ambitious, your little brother's face. Air holes? Optional. Vision slits? Strictly theoretical. After 5 minutes, you've sweated through your eyebrows, your cheeks are on fire, and the only thing scarier than your appearance is the internal buildup of carbon dioxide. Taking off the mask feels like a religious experience. Some children get so attached, literally, that the only way out is with the kitchen scissors. But let's talk about accessories, because what's a goblin without props? Tails and horns are attached with pitch, melted candle wax, or the famous just tie it really tight and hope. If you're impersonating a demon, which is encouraged, you'll want to rub some lampblack or soot on your arms and hands. This works perfectly, unless you encounter rain, sweat, or a stray dog with a taste for the theatrical. If you're a ghost, you're probably wearing a sheet that's been in the family for generations and is conveniently transparent in all the wrong places. Beware of open flames. One swoosh of your spectral train and you'll be haunting the parlor for real. Of course, Safety is not on anyone's mind. The only warning you might hear is, don't get the curtains dirty, rather than don't set yourself alight. Most parlors are a minefield of candles, fireplaces, and oil lamps. If your costume includes trailing fabric, you're basically a mobile wick. Nothing livens up a party quite like the smell of singed wool and the frantic flapping of a child in a flaming turnip mask. And then there's the paint. Oh, the glorious, toxic paint. Victorians loved a good colour, and they weren't about to let health concerns get in the way of a festive palette. Green came from arsenic compounds, white from lead, and red from anything that stained, including mercurial concoctions or whatever was left at the chemist's shop. By midnight, everyone's coughing, the masks are sagging, and the family cat has a mysterious stripe of Prussian blue down its back. If you're lucky, the worst that happens is a mild rash and a new phobia of hats. If you're unlucky, you finish the evening with a costume that's both a fashion statement and an obituary. Modern Halloween may have its risks, choking on a candy corn or tripping over a dog in a pumpkin suit, but nothing compares to the Victorian gauntlet of open flames, bad ventilation, and costumes that actively tried to kill you. So as you slip into your synthetic, flame-retardant superhero suit this year, spare a thought for the children of 1879. They went out into the fog, faces smeared with substances now banned in 47 countries, determined to terrify their neighbors and possibly themselves. That's the real spirit of Halloween. A willingness to suffer for the sake of a good scare. A great story. And, if you survive the night, a lifetime of being just a little bit wary of homemade costumes. Ghosts weren't just for stories, they were big business. Victorians booked séances the way we book spa days. Whether you were a believer or just there for the free punch, the chance of accidentally inviting something unfriendly was always high. Also, the candles were a fire code violation waiting to happen. Let's step into the dimly lit parlor of your average middle-class home. Somewhere between the aspidistra and the ancestral portrait that never stops watching you. The furniture is rearranged, the table is round, and the air is thick with the scent of paraffin and nervous anticipation. Outside, London's fog presses against the window. Inside, someone is insisting you hold hands with the vicar, who smells suspiciously of gin. Welcome to Victorian spiritualism, where the line between entertainment, existential dread, and outright con artistry was even blurrier than your Aunt Maud's eyesight. Séances weren't just a passing trend, they were a full-on obsession. Your average social calendar in the 1870s went something like this. Tea with the Thompsons, séance with the spirit of Lady Agatha, and, if you made it through, a brisk game of whist. Professional mediums flourished. Every neighborhood had at least one, usually a mysterious woman in voluminous skirts who claimed to hear voices and who, according to rumor, once made the family dog levitate. The more elaborate the backstory, the higher the fee. Some claimed to channel Egyptian pharaohs. Others preferred local ghosts with a grudge about church pews. Once everyone was gathered, the real fun began. The room went dark, the medium took center stage, and out came the mystical spirit board, which looked suspiciously like a fancy cheese platter with extra letters. Sometimes there was table turning, a game where everyone pressed their fingertips to the edge of a table and waited for it to shudder or leap into the air. In theory, the spirits moved it. In reality, it was probably Cousin Edward, who took leg day very seriously. Of course, séances were a social minefield. On one hand, you wanted a good show. On the other, you didn't want the haunting to become too literal. The candles, usually far too numerous and balanced precariously on every available surface, provided an atmosphere that was equal parts spooky and arson risk. One clumsy elbow, and suddenly the séance was interrupted by a spirited round of bucket brigade. Ghost clubs soon emerged for the more dedicated haunt enthusiast. Think of it as an early version of a paranormal meetup group, but with even more awkward facial hair. London alone boasted several, where gentlemen in starched collars debated the finer points of spectral etiquette. Was it proper to address a ghost directly, or should one go through the medium? Could spirits be bribed with port wine? These were the burning questions of the age. For many, seances weren't just a chance to gawk at a floating handkerchief. They were deadly serious. The Victorians, living in an age of rampant disease and industrial accidents, were obsessed with the idea of contacting lost loved ones. Grief was big business, and mediums were happy to oblige. A good seance could provide comfort, closure, or just a convenient scapegoat for why the good silver had gone missing again. But not all spirits were friendly. There were stories of seances gone awry, phantom knocks, shattering glass, or the terrifying spirit writing, which, more often than not, spelled out ominous messages like "your sock is under the cutch." Sometimes, the scariest thing summoned was an unpaid bill. And yet, through all the melodrama and mild peril, Victorians adored their ghostly gatherings. Even skeptics joined in, if only for the chance to mock the medium, or perhaps to flirt in the dark with minimal supervision. A séance was the perfect place for a little harmless chaos, a lot of nervous laughter, and, with luck, only a minor singe to the carpet. So the next time you think about lighting a candle and asking your Alexa for a sign from beyond, spare a thought for your Victorian forebears. They risked their eyebrows, their dignity, and occasionally their best wallpaper, all for a glimpse of the afterlife, or at least a really good story for the next day's tea. Trick-or-treating Victorian style was more like a shakedown. Kids demanded treats in exchange for not vandalizing your house or serenading you with mildly threatening song. Refuse, and you'd spend the next week picking eggshells and mysterious substances off your doorstep. Picture it. A chilly October evening. London's streets lined with fog, horse droppings, and a suspicious lack of neighborhood watch. Suddenly, there's a knock at your door. You peer through the smudged window pane to see a gaggle of soot-smudged urchins, all armed with sacks, sticks, and a highly developed sense of entitlement. They launch into song, less jolly carol and more musical protection racket. The lyrics promise health, fortune, and goodwill as long as you hand over the goodies. Fail to comply, and you're in for a week of nocturnal terror, involving eggs, mud, or the dreaded dead thing in the letterbox. It's the original pay-up or else. This wasn't the sanitized, store-bought, fun-size candy operation you know today. There were no pre-wrapped chocolates or smiling parents lurking in the shadows. Instead, the currency of choice was apples, nuts, cold coins, or whatever baked goods could be scrounged together. If you were especially unlucky, you might end up handing out last year's fruitcake, a move guaranteed to put your house on the high-risk prank list. The rules were simple and unwritten. The older the child, the greater the threat level. Youngsters might settle for a crust of bread and a smile. But a teenager with a sack full of rocks and a pocket full of limericks was a one-person insurance risk. If you lived on the nice side of town, you could expect a polite knock and a hopeful grin. If your address was less posh, or you'd made the mistake of denying treats last year, expect to be serenaded with verses containing your name, your dog's name, and thinly veiled references to what might befall your vegetable patch. Let's talk about the songs. Victorian trick-or-treat songs were not composed to put anyone at ease. These were mildly menacing, passive-aggressive jingles, warning the listener that if a treat was not forthcoming, dire consequences would follow. A penny for the poor or your gate gets the war might be the clean version. Some songs included elaborate descriptions of misfortune, from spoiled milk to rats in the pantry. Others went for straight-up threats, delivered with a cheerful smile and a bow. If you tried to ignore the children, things escalated. You might wake the next morning to find your windows smeared with lard, your doorknob tied shut, or a chicken relocated to your drawing room. Some neighborhoods became battlegrounds, with homeowners arming themselves with brooms and buckets in a desperate bid to protect their doorsteps. In the best-case scenario, you gave out a few apples and were left in peace. In the worst case, you spent the week scrubbing creative stains off your porch and fielding complaints from your neighbors about the spontaneous goat parade that originated from your garden gate. Of course, not everyone took this lying down. Some clever adults fought back, rigging up their own surprises, exploding flour sacks, buckets of water, or the classic unexpectedly loud noise. But such retaliation was risky. Too much enthusiasm, and you'd find yourself the target of next year's revenge tour, headlined by every child in a 3-block radius. Trick-or-treating was not a one-night contract. It was a delicate, ongoing negotiation that determined the safety of your home for the entire autumn. This annual ritual became so widespread that newspapers published warnings about Halloween blackmailers, urging parents to keep their children indoors and advising householders to double-check their locks. The line between innocent mischief and outright harassment was not just blurred, it was enthusiastically danced across, preferably while wearing a homemade mask and bellowing the latest threat ditty. Yet, for all its menace, there was something undeniably communal about Victorian trick-or-treating. Everyone participated, everyone expected it. And, once the mud was washed off and the eggshells scraped away, everyone swapped stories over the garden fence. Did you see what they did to the vicar's carriage? I heard someone put a trout in Mrs. Biddle's umbrella stand. Mischief was both a crime and a celebration, a reminder that sometimes the best way to ward off evil is to out-crazy it for a night. So if you ever wonder why Halloween today feels so tame, remember the Victorians and their enterprising, slightly menacing trick-or-treaters. Their motto? Give us apples or else. And frankly, who could argue with that? Victorian pranksters loved flower bombs, bags of flour tied to doorways that exploded in a cloud of powder when someone opened the door. The best-case scenario? Mild inconvenience. The worst? An irate housekeeper and a week-long coughing fit. Let's take a walk down a typical London row, Halloween night. You approach your front door, thinking only of tea and a bit of peace after a long day elbow-deep in coal dust and passive aggression. But as you turn the handle, swoosh! You're instantly enveloped in a snowstorm of cheap flour, the sort more suited for brick paste than baking. It's on your coat, in your ears, coating your eyebrows, and already working its way into every crack in your ancient wooden floorboards. In the flickering light of the hallway, you look less like a respectable citizen and more like a haunted pastry. You cough, you sputter, you try to regain dignity as your neighbors snicker from behind their curtains. The kids in the alley are doubled over, giggling so hard one of them might actually throw up. But don't bother shaking your fist. The true genius of the flower bomb is that its creators have already melted away, leaving nothing but a dusting of evidence and your wounded pride. The mechanics of the Victorian flower bomb are impressively simple. All it takes is a cloth bag, a bit of string, and the courage to risk being caught by the town's most easily enraged maid. Some pranksters fill socks, others use old handkerchiefs, whatever holds powder and can survive a few hours in the cold. The device is tied carefully to the inside of a doorway, set so it drops and explodes when the door is opened. Sometimes, for extra drama, the pranksters add a handful of feathers just to make sure your hallway looks like the aftermath of a low-budget pillow fight. Housekeepers, of course, are the true victims here. If you think modern cleaning is a struggle, try dusting flour out of woolen carpets and between the floorboards of a Victorian townhouse. For days, every step raises a fresh puff of white, reminding everyone in the household of your failure to predict the world's most obvious prank. There's no vacuum cleaner, just brooms, buckets, and a growing sense of existential defeat. But not all flower bombs are created equal. Some go off perfectly, producing a gentle puff and a round of polite laughter. Others, packed by overzealous pranksters, explode with such force that the victim is rendered invisible, a ghostly silhouette emerging from the haze, clutching their chest and vowing revenge. And woe betide the prankster who underestimates a determined Victorian matron. Many an ambitious youth has found themselves on the wrong end of a scrubbing brush, sentenced to a week of cleaning out the privy in penance for a particularly effective, or just particularly messy, bomb. What's most remarkable is how flower bombs become an annual arms race. Each year, the engineering gets more elaborate. Hidden tripwires, double bag bombs, sometimes even a little pepper for spice. If you're unlucky enough to be a local dignitary or the town's least favorite shopkeeper, you might find yourself the target of a coordinated flower attack, as multiple doors and windows are rigged for maximum chaos. Entire neighborhoods become battlegrounds, with adults arming themselves with umbrellas and children laying traps like mischievous home defense contractors. For some pranksters, the fun isn't just in the explosion, it's in the anticipation. Hours spent crouched behind hedges, breath steaming in the night, waiting for the moment their victim returns. When it finally happens, there's a chorus of suppressed laughter, a flurry of footsteps, and the knowledge that, for once, the boring routine of Victorian life has been upended by pure, powdery chaos. The flower bomb isn't just a prank. It's a tradition, a rite of passage for Victorian youth, a story for next year's Halloween, and an ongoing battle between creativity and household order. And in a world before television or the internet, sometimes a simple trick with a sack of flour was all it took to make life memorable, if only for a week's worth of sneezing. So next time you open a door and nothing explodes in your face, spare a grateful thought for the housekeepers of yesteryear and for the bold pranksters who turned the bakery aisle into the most dangerous part of Victorian Halloween. Nothing says festive like borrowing a coffin from the undertaker and leaving it in someone's hallway. Sometimes, pranksters would go a step further and stage fake funerals. Occasionally, the only thing dead was the neighborly goodwill. Victorian Halloween wasn't just about scaring your friends with a carved turnip or sneaking a frog into the apple-bobbing tub. No, the real connoisseurs of mischief wanted to stage a scene so dramatic, so unsettling, that it would become the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. Enter the coffin prank, a stunt so elaborate and morbid that it perfectly captured the era's obsession with death and their willingness to take a joke way, way too far. Imagine waking up to the gentle, not at all foreboding creak of your front door, only to find a full-size coffin resting casually in your entryway. It's not just a box, it's a statement. Someone here has a lot of free time, access to funeral supplies, and possibly a future in avant-garde theatre. The sight alone is enough to chill the marrow. In a time when death was both familiar and terrifying, thanks to everything from cholera to stray chimney pots, finding a coffin on your welcome mat was more than a prank. It was a moment of existential dread with a side of slapstick. The real masters of this art didn't stop at empty coffins. No. A proper Halloween required at least one corpse, constructed with all the artistry of a haunted tailor's workshop. Sometimes it was a pile of rags with a carved turnip for a head. Other times a willing accomplice lay inside, ready to pop up at the perfect moment and guarantee at least one fainting spell and a minor heart condition for the recipient. A few overachievers even staged full mock funerals, with pallbearers, a sorrowful procession, and a eulogy so overblown that the only thing more dead than the deceased was the punchline. If you were lucky, the victim was just confused or mildly inconvenienced. But often these pranks pushed the boundaries of good taste, especially when the local undertaker realized someone had borrowed his best casket for an evening of mischief. Coffins weren't cheap, and neither was the wrath of a professional whose entire business depended on dignity and solemnity. More than one prankster ended up digging graves for free as penance, a task that probably made them reconsider whether comedic timing was worth shoveling mud at midnight. The reaction from the community varied wildly. In some circles, the prank became a badge of honor, a sign that your household was interesting enough to merit such a high-profile scare. In others, it triggered full-scale neighborhood feuds, complete with anonymous letters, calls for stricter Halloween discipline, and, inevitably, retaliatory pranks involving livestock or liberal applications of treacle on the front gate. For some, it was all in good fun. For others, it was grounds for a formal complaint to the parish council, or at least a passive-aggressive fruitcake come Christmas. Of course, there was always the risk that the joke would go horribly wrong. Victorians, it must be said, were not famous for their robust cardiovascular health. More than one corpse found themselves on the wrong end of a swinging umbrella, an airborne candlestick, or a hastily thrown chamber pot. And woe to the prankster who failed to coordinate with the household's schedule and accidentally interrupted a real wake or funeral. Nothing ruins a haunting quite like colliding with an actual mourner. Despite these hazards, the coffin prank endured, cementing itself as the gold standard of Halloween tomfoolery. It was part spectacle, part social commentary, and part therapy for a culture obsessed with mortality. In a way, it was cathartic. Laughing in the face of death, even if just for a night, was its own kind of rebellion. So if you ever find yourself feeling nostalgic for the gentle pranks of today, teepee in the trees, maybe a plastic skeleton on the porch, remember the Victorians and their coffin capers. For them, Halloween wasn't just about scares. It was about staging a drama, testing boundaries, and proving once and for all that nothing, absolutely nothing, was sacred on Mischief Night. If you've never woken up to find your outdoor privy rigged with a screaming automaton, you haven't truly experienced Victorian Halloween. Ingenious and profoundly unhygienic, the haunted outhouse prank became legendary in certain towns, especially those with a strong plumbing union. Let's set the scene. It's the witching hour, the coal fire's barely flickering, and you're shuffling through the fog to your backyard outhouse, possibly the only private space you get all year. The moon is a smudge behind chimney smoke, your slippers are wet, and all you want is a quiet moment far from your snoring relatives. Instead, you lower yourself onto the chilly wooden seat, only to be met by an unholy shriek from the darkness beneath. You jump up, heart hammering, and possibly discover your neighbor's pet ferret has been redeployed as a special effect. Congratulations. You're now wide awake, slightly traumatized, and in urgent need of new undergarments. This, believe it or not, was not considered a breach of etiquette. The haunted outhouse prank was practically an art form, developed by pranksters who viewed indoor plumbing, or the Victorian lack thereof, as the ultimate canvas for their creativity. The setup could range from a simple jack-in-the-box mechanism, triggered by the weight of an unsuspecting posterior, to more elaborate designs involving pulleys, hidden noisemakers, and, if you were unlucky, a live chicken tied to a string. The resulting cacophony would rattle even the most stoic of family patriarchs and send wordless tales of terror rippling through the neighborhood. Victorian plumbing, already more suggestion than science, didn't help matters. Outhouses were cold, dark, and echoed in a way that turned even a gentle boo into a demonic chorus. Some pranksters slipped painted skulls under the seat or hung ghostly rags from the rafters, timed to drift down and brush the face of anyone foolish enough to look up. Others engineered more sophisticated scares. A bucket of cold water balanced overhead, triggered by the latch, or an arrangement of pans and spoons that would clang together like a haunted one-man band. There was, inevitably, a cost to this performance art. Sometimes the machinery malfunctioned, and the prankster themselves wound up doused, bruised, or, in one memorable case, stuck headfirst in the privy for hours. Local tradesmen, especially plumbers and carpenters, found a seasonal side hustle in repairing outhouses, replacing broken seats, and occasionally exercising particularly vengeful geese. Stories of haunted privies made the rounds in pubs, each more outrageous than the last. Old man Tibbins hasn't used his outhouse since it told him to repent, or Mrs. Grimsby fainted so hard she cracked a floorboard. But if you think these pranks were limited to rowdy children or bored farmhands, think again. The haunted outhouse was a truly democratic tradition. From mischievous maids to cunning grandmothers, anyone could get in on the action. Some families prided themselves on their haunt, swapping ideas and equipment, and keeping meticulous records of who'd been got each year. The most competitive pranksters upped the ante, staging outrage relays where one victim would stagger from the haunted privy, only to be lured back by a second, even worse surprise. Revenge was swift and creative. If you survived your haunted bathroom experience, you were honor-bound to return the favor. Some set up decoy traps, obvious buckets that did nothing, or stuffed ghosts that looked menacing but were harmless, just to lull pranksters into a false sense of security before unleashing the real horror. Think cold porridge, live frogs, or a sternly worded note from the vicar from beyond the grave. All this for a holiday no one was quite sure how to celebrate. The haunted outhouse was the perfect symbol for Victorian Halloween. Equal parts ingenuity, gross-out humor, and an underlying desire to startle your loved ones into next Thursday. It was performance art, plumbing disaster, and pure community spirit, sometimes all in the same night. So if you're ever nostalgic for a simpler, scarier, less hygienic time, imagine this. It's midnight, the wind howls, and somewhere in the darkness, a privy is screaming. Is it a ghost? A goose? Or just the echo of 1,000 pranks, reminding you that no tradition is too sacred, not even the call of nature itself? Victorians may have invented the classic bedsheet ghost, a prank so simple anyone could try it, and most did. The result? Startled servants, broken crockery, and the occasional unfortunate tumble down the stairs. Let's take a moment to appreciate the elegant stupidity of the bedsheet ghost. You don't need fancy materials or questionable household chemicals. Just an old linen, a pair of scissors, and the willingness to stumble around half-blind in the dark. It's the sort of DIY project that appeals to both the mischievous child and the bored adult. For the Victorians, who rarely passed up an opportunity to frighten the help or humiliate a cousin, it quickly became the seasonal pastime of choice. It usually began after a few cups of mulled wine and a round of macabre ghost stories by the fireside. Someone, often the family's least mature member or a mischievous uncle, would disappear upstairs and return a few minutes later as the most discount spectre you've ever seen. A lumpy, sheet-draped figure, shuffling into the drawing room with arms outstretched and making noises that ranged from hollow moans to suspicious giggles. The effect was rarely subtle and never dignified. The beauty of the bedsheet ghost was in its versatility. Too lazy to cut eye holes? No problem. Just stumble around and rely on sound. Too cheap to sacrifice the good linen? Use whatever's in the laundry pile, which might explain why some Victorian ghosts looked suspiciously like a walking pair of bloomers. The real thrill, though, was in the reactions. Servants screamed, children shrieked, and adults sometimes joined in the panic, at least until someone tripped over the piano stool or sent a teapot flying through the air. Of course, the classic boo wasn't always a solo act. Some households took it up a notch, staging elaborate haunting scenes. Imagine 3 or 4 ghosts moving in choreographed chaos through the darkened halls, a cacophony of fake wailing and rattling chains borrowed from the cellar. The more ambitious pranksters incorporated props. A lantern glowing beneath the sheet for a truly hellish effect, or a handful of flour tossed into the air to create an otherworldly mist, and a cleaning bill the size of Yorkshire. Sometimes, the bedsheet ghost was more than a prank. It became a weapon in the ongoing war of nerves between siblings or neighbors. A well-timed apparition at midnight, hovering silently at the foot of the bed, could inspire weeks of sleepless nights and at least one awkward letter to the family doctor. And nothing spread rumors through a village faster than a servant's shriek echoing down the lane, followed by wild tales of the pale lady of number 43, or the howling wraith in the vicarage. Of course, as with all things Victorian, safety was an afterthought at best. Dim gaslighting, loose rugs, and the absence of anything resembling OSHA regulations meant that a night of ghostly pranks usually ended with at least one sprained ankle and a heated debate over who had to replace the broken vase. There was always the risk that a real emergency, a fire, a burglar, or just Aunt Mildred on her nightly sleepwalk, would get lost in the parade of pretend poltergeists. Yet, for all the chaos and collateral damage, the bedsheet ghost endured. It was cheap, it was easy, and it was fun. A rare combination in an era more often associated with grim discipline and starched collars. If you managed to startle even one person, your night was a success. If you escaped unscathed and with your dignity mostly intact, you were practically a legend. So next time you see a child in a too long sheet shouting boo, remember, they're part of a long, proud, slightly ridiculous tradition. The Victorians turned household linens into legendary monsters and, in doing so, proved that sometimes the simplest scares are the best. Because when it comes to Halloween, you don't need special effects, just a sense of mischief, a sturdy sheet, and the courage to risk tumbling down the stairs in pursuit of the perfect fright. Not all pranks were pointless chaos. Some Victorians organized charity tricks, where the wealthy pretended to be beggars or staged elaborate ruses to raise money for the poor. It's like GoFundMe, but with more confusion and less accountability. Let's step into the mind of a Victorian philanthropist. Someone with a heart of gold and a sense of humor, forged in coal dust and questionable sherry. Halloween was already a time for mayhem and misrule, so why not sprinkle in a little social good? Thus, the charity prank was born. The premise was simple. You disguise yourself, usually in the most threadbare rags you could find, and embark on a night of trickery with the noble goal of collecting alms, only to donate the haul to those genuinely in need. Of course, this being the Victorians, no good deed was done without a heavy dose of theatricality. Groups of local gentry or aspiring do-gooders would band together to stage elaborate stunts. You might find the mayor's wife, normally spotted behind a mountain of lace and a wall of disapproval, down on the high street, rattling a tin cup and wailing about her lost inheritance. Her friends would dart around the crowd, pockets full of stale bread and surplus apples, all the while passing notes and trading winks as they plotted their next move. The charity pranksters weren't content with a simple handout. Oh no, they staged charity chases where costumed beggars would scamper through the town square, pursued by policemen, usually the vicar's sons in borrowed helmets. Onlookers were encouraged to toss coins or food into baskets as the mayhem swirled around them. Some events grew so elaborate that they bordered on public theatre, complete with scripted arrests, farcical courtroom dramas, and enough melodrama to make Charles Dickens himself weep with envy. For many townsfolk, it was the highlight of the season. A chance to poke fun at social boundaries, lampoon the local nobility, and raise money for causes like the orphanage or the widow's fund. Of course, a few wealthy pranksters couldn't resist taking things a step further. There are accounts of anonymous mystery donors who would orchestrate treasure hunts with cryptic clues, leaving coins hidden in flour sacks, under cobblestones, or even sewn into the lining of a neighbor's coat. Some charity pranks became legendary, told and retold, until nobody remembered if they actually happened or were simply another tall tale traded by the fire. But like all good intentions, charity pranks weren't without their share of chaos. Mistaken identities abounded. More than one actual beggar found themselves the recipient of a hearty slap on the back from Lord Wigglesworth, who assumed he was congratulating a fellow prankster in disguise. Sometimes the dividing line between jest and genuine hardship got dangerously thin. There were disputes over whose donations went where, and more than a few awkward conversations the next morning when the local constable discovered he'd locked up a baronet's son for excessive mendicant enthusiasm. Still, for all the confusion and mild social upheaval, charity pranksters left their mark. Money was raised, spirits were lifted. And perhaps, for a brief moment, the boundaries between rich and poor blurred, united by a shared sense of absurdity and the universal desire to outwit both custom and each other. After all, if you're going to subvert society's expectations, why not do it with a pie to the face and a handful of shillings for the poor? As the fog rolled back and the pranksters revealed themselves, often to the surprise of everyone, including themselves, the coins were counted, the bread redistributed, and the rumors began anew. Who was the masked benefactor who put a guinea in the baker's jar? Did the vicar really chase a ghost through the churchyard, only to find it was the mayor's daughter with a bag of penny sweets? The answers mattered less than the memories. Of laughter in the dark, kindness dressed in rags, and a community brought together by mischief with a mission. So next time someone tries to sell you on a charity challenge, remember the Victorians did it first, and probably with more slapstick, and definitely more questionable facial hair. Sometimes, a good cause just needs a little chaos. If you ever thought junk mail was bad, imagine opening your letterbox to a sudden puff of pepper dust or a spring-loaded frog. Victorian pranksters took postal mischief to a new level, proving that nobody was safe, not even the postman. Picture a quiet Halloween morning in 1880s London. The city is waking up, the air is crisp, and you, respectable, responsible citizen, shuffle out in your slippers to collect the morning's post. You're expecting the usual, bills, a passive-aggressive note from your neighbor, perhaps a circular about medicinal bitters. Instead, you open your letterbox and, poof, a cloud of sneezing powder engulfs your face. You stagger backward, eyes streaming, dignity in tatters, as half the block looks on from behind their curtains, waiting to see if you'll sneeze out your mustache. This was the age of the Great Letterbox Scare, when Halloween became the busiest season for postal pranks. Victorians, ingenious, slightly unhinged, and with far too much time on their hands, realized that the humble letterbox was the perfect gateway to chaos. No home was immune, and no one, especially not the postman, could ever truly relax. Every clink of the mail slot became a tiny drum roll for disaster. The arsenal of mailbox mischief was impressive, if not always practical. Pepper dust was a favorite, not just because it made for spectacular sneezing, but because it clung to carpets and curtains for days, prolonging the suffering. More ambitious pranksters engineered elaborate devices. Little bags of flour that burst on impact, springs loaded with confetti or dried peas, and in one infamous case, an entire live frog, crammed into an envelope with enough room to leap out and wreak havoc. And the terror wasn't just for recipients. Postmen, the unsung heroes of Victorian correspondence, lived in perpetual fear during the Halloween season. Some took to tapping the boxes with their delivery stick before posting the letters. Others donned goggles or even handkerchiefs tied like highwaymen just in case. Stories spread of postal workers being chased down the street by angry cockerels released from especially inventive parcels, or having to apologize for mysterious stains left in the wake of exploding bottles of ink. If you were lucky, the worst you got was a fine dusting of flour or a cascade of dried beans. If you were unlucky, you got the infamous Devil's Letter, a folded sheet designed to burst open and shower you with itching powder. Or, for the truly unfortunate, a glue trap that would leave your fingers stuck together for days. Some pranksters even sent elaborate fake telegrams, summoning recipients to haunted locations for imaginary emergencies or promising inheritances from dubious foreign relatives. The genius of the letterbox prank was its democratic spirit. Anyone with a scrap of imagination and a grudge against the local grocer could get involved. Children plotted in secret. Adults got their revenge for years of loud Sunday singing. And even the vicar occasionally slipped a carrot into the baker's mail for his eyesight. The boundary between prank and outright postal harassment was never very clear, but in the name of tradition, the town turned a blind eye, unless someone's grandmother got caught in the crossfire, in which case it became a topic for heated debate at the next parish meeting. Of course, the aftermath was always a sight. Hallways dusted in white, letters glued to the floor, a parade of frogs hopping through the drawing room while the family cat launched a panicked counterattack. Local papers sometimes printed warnings, "Beware the Halloween letter," and a few enterprising inventors even marketed prank-proof letterboxes with spring-loaded flaps and secret compartments, none of which actually worked. Yet, beneath all the coughing, sneezing, and occasional amphibian chaos, the Great Letterbox Scare was a reminder of the era's spirit. In a world where life could be dull, rules were many, and fun was always a little bit dangerous. Victorians took their chances where they could find them, even if it meant risking life, limb, or at least a dry cleaning bill. The next time you sigh at a pile of junk mail, just be grateful it doesn't croak, sneeze, or bite back. Victorian Halloween. Not even your post was safe. Halloween treats were a gamble. Was that apple covered in delicious toffee, or was it a cleverly disguised ball of wax? Sometimes, pranksters even spiked treats with pepper or mustard for maximum unpleasantness. Trust, but verify. Welcome to the Victorian Halloween snack table, where dessert doubles as a practical joke and nothing is quite what it seems. Imagine a candlelit parlor, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke and anticipation. Bowls of shiny apples glisten next to paper-wrapped sweets and candied fruits. It all looks innocent, even inviting, until you remember that this is the one night a year when the only thing scarier than the ghost stories is the dessert tray. The game is simple, trick or treat, emphasis on the trick. Victorians prided themselves on their hospitality, but Halloween gave everyone a free pass to turn that hospitality into an elaborate trust exercise. Pranksters would spend days preparing their specialties. The centerpiece was the wax apple, a marvel of culinary deceit. These apples were painstakingly carved and painted, often with just enough skill to fool even the most suspicious guest. There's nothing quite like the look on someone's face when they take a hearty bite, expecting juicy fruit, and get a mouthful of wax and existential dread instead. And if the wax apple was the Mona Lisa of edible pranks, the poison sweet was the Rembrandt. Subtle, insidious, and guaranteed to leave a mark. Poisoned, of course, meant things like mustard, horseradish, or enough black pepper to stun a small goat. Imagine biting into what you think is a sugary drop only to have your sinuses cleared out faster than a Victorian street after a cholera warning. Sweets could be filled with vinegar, stuffed with a hidden lump of soap, or, for the truly ambitious, dusted with cayenne. Children learned early. Never trust a treat from someone who looked too pleased with themselves. But the real joy came in the group reveal. After a round of snacks, the parlor would erupt in coughing, spluttering, and the kind of nervous laughter only heard at dentist offices and near-death experiences. Some family members pretended not to notice, stoically chewing on their wax apple, as if it were the world's most disappointing toffee. Others theatrically fanned their burning mouths, reaching for the punch bowl like they'd just run a marathon. At least one uncle inevitably tried to pass off his misfortune as good for the digestion, while a more competitive aunt might sneak the peppered treat into someone else's pocket for a little delayed revenge. Of course, in the true spirit of Victorian escalation, this edible mischief was sometimes taken too far. There were rumors, likely exaggerated, but possibly true, of pranksters making onions look like apples, or swapping sugar with salt for the family's prized jam tart recipe. The line between fun and food crime was blurry at best. The aftermath could be spectacular: weeping guests, ruined tablecloths, and stern warnings from housekeepers who'd had quite enough of culinary experiments. Thank you very much. Not even the drinks were safe. Some clever souls spiked the cider with a dash of vinegar or slipped a pickle into the wassail bowl. If you escaped the snack table with your taste buds intact, you were considered a Halloween champion. Small wonder that many guests brought their own emergency biscuit, just in case, and eyed every offering with suspicion worthy of a professional food taster. Despite the hazards, edible pranks were strangely beloved. They were a way to test your luck, bond with friends and enemies alike, and liven up a season otherwise filled with fog, mud, and long stories about Great Aunt Hilda's poltergeist. Besides, nothing brought a family together like watching Grandpa discover his candied plum was actually a garlic clove wrapped in sugar. So next time you unwrap a store-bought sweet or pick out a perfect apple, remember the brave souls of Victorian Halloween who risked their dignity, digestion, and sometimes their dental work, all in the name of good fun and edible treachery. Trust, but definitely verify. And maybe keep a glass of water close by, just in case. Pranksters frequently borrowed, or outright stole, livestock to release into public spaces. Picture a goat in a top hat wandering through your parlor, and you get the general idea. The chaos was legendary, the cleanup less so. Let's journey to a Victorian town square just after sunset. All seems peaceful, if you ignore the persistent smell of damp wool and the faint, nervous clucking coming from a suspiciously lumpy basket. But if you listen closely, you'll hear giggles from behind the hedgerow and see a pair of boots darting across the cobblestones. Within minutes, Halloween has become the livestock Olympics. In an age before social media, nothing said I was here quite like smuggling a farm animal into an inconvenient place. The classic move was the parlor prank. Sneak a goat, pig, or particularly belligerent goose through the side gate and let it loose where it would cause the most mayhem. Goats, the undisputed kings of mischief, took to their roles with relish. One moment the room was filled with polite conversation about the cost of firewood. The next, a bearded blur in a hat was making a beeline for the pudding tray, scattering ladies and lace doilies in all directions. But why stop at goats? Geese were another favorite. These creatures, all attitude and very little impulse control, could clear a room faster than a cholera outbreak. Released into a parlor, or, for the truly ambitious, a church nave, a flock of honking geese would turn solemn gatherings into slapstick farces. One memorable account describes the vicar's sermon ending with a cacophony of feathers and furious honks as pranksters liberated the parish's entire goose flock mid-psalm. Of course, the animals themselves didn't come pre-accessorized. No self-respecting Victorian prankster would send a goat into battle without some flair. Top hats, bows, even a hasty cloak fashioned from an old curtain. By the end of the night, it wasn't unusual to find a sheep dressed as Queen Victoria or a duck sporting a monocle. These efforts weren't just for laughs, though they were plentiful. They were a form of competitive art. If your animal failed to startle at least 3 guests or cause a minor property crisis, you simply weren't trying hard enough. The aftermath was never pretty. A goat in the parlor might be good for a story, but it was murder on the upholstery. Feathered guests left presents on every available surface. And retrieving a terrified pig from under the sideboard was a team sport requiring patience, courage, and occasionally a new sideboard. Local maids and housekeepers, already operating at the limits of human endurance, would band together for the cleanup, muttering darkly about mischief nights and what the world is coming to. Not all animal antics were confined to the indoors. Pranksters sometimes escalated to larger-scale chaos. Cows wandered main roads in bonnets. Someone's prized ram would end up tied to the pub's signpost, serenaded by drunken choruses. Chickens found their way into classrooms, rabbits invaded the milliners, and, on at least one occasion, an entire cartload of ducks was released in the mayor's garden, leading to an afternoon of frantic quacking and a strongly worded editorial in the town paper. For the animals, the pranks were usually bewildering but brief, although more than one goat developed a taste for cake and a keen eye for open doors. For the townsfolk, the pranks became the stuff of legend, recounted every Halloween with more detail and less accuracy each year. Remember when your father found the goose in his Sunday hat? I'll never forget the pig in the pantry, ate all the apples and half the soap. So next time you see a Halloween prank video online, spare a thought for the Victorians, whose mischief required livestock, a flair for the dramatic, and absolutely no sense of indoor boundaries. Because nothing says festive spirit like chasing a bow-tied goat through your best sitting room at 2 in the morning. That, my friend, is true Halloween tradition. One of the cheapest and eeriest pranks involved nothing but a stick and some patience. Pranksters would tap on windows, walls, and pipes late at night, convincing the superstitious that spirits were at work. Nothing like sleep deprivation to foster community spirit. Let's dim the gas lamps and slip quietly into the heart of Victorian suburbia, where the only thing thinner than the walls is the townsfolk's collective nerve. You're tucked in your lumpy mattress, halfway between a dream about treacle pudding and a nightmare about unpaid debts, when tap, tap, tap. The sound is faint at first. Maybe it's the wind, you think. Maybe it's that squirrel with a grudge. But then it happens again and again, until every hair on the back of your neck is standing at attention, and you're suddenly very aware of just how many ghost stories you've consumed before bed. The beauty of nocturnal tapping was its simplicity. There were no complicated mechanisms or elaborate costumes, just a willingness to lurk in the darkness, armed with a stick, a bit of old rope, or, for advanced practitioners, a pebble on a string. The aim was to find a victim, usually a sibling, sometimes a neighbor, occasionally a particularly jumpy grandparent, and keep them guessing all night long. You'd sneak around the house, tap, tap, tapping, just out of sight. Perhaps on a window ledge, the side of a garden shed, or even along the plumbing pipes that snaked through the walls of every respectable home. Superstition was at its peak during the Victorian era. People firmly believed in ghosts, poltergeists, and spirits of the restless dead. The faintest sound could be interpreted as a warning from beyond, a curse, or Aunt Maud making her displeasure known from the other side. Pranksters knew this and took full advantage. A few well-placed taps in the dead of night could leave an entire household whispering about omens and hastily revising their wills. If you were particularly mischievous or had access to the attic, you might add footsteps to your repertoire. Dragging a heavy boot across the rafters or pacing slowly down a creaky corridor was guaranteed to set nerves jangling. For an encore, you could rattle a window latch or let loose a perfectly timed ghostly moan down the chimney. If you were feeling especially devious, you'd recruit a friend to tap in synchrony from the other side of the house, creating a cacophony of spectral activity that would have even the family dog refusing to budge from under the bed. Sleep deprivation soon became a group activity. The bravest souls would rise, candle in hand, to investigate. Bedsheets wrapped tightly, they'd tiptoe through the halls, convinced they were about to encounter a restless ancestor or a burglar with a peculiar sense of rhythm. The investigation would end with a chorus of shrieks when a door slammed unexpectedly or the prankster revealed themselves with a triumphant boo. The rest of the night would be spent in mutual suspicion, as everyone tried to guess who among them was the true architect of the terror. This prank didn't stop at the home either. Pranksters roamed the village streets, tapping on shop windows, church doors, and even the walls of the local inn. One particularly persistent group was said to have kept an entire boarding house awake for a week, leading to mass complaints and a strongly worded letter to the local newspaper on the menace of nocturnal disturbances. And yet, for all the sleep lost and nerves frayed, there was an odd sense of unity forged in the night. In the morning, as neighbors compared tales of the phantom footsteps, suspicion slowly gave way to laughter and, in some cases, elaborate plans for revenge. The Victorians understood, in their own twisted way, that nothing bonds a community quite like a shared scare and a collective grudge against a mystery tapper. So next time you hear a bump in the night, take comfort. It's probably not a ghost. More likely, it's just history's oldest prank, echoing through the pipes, making sure nobody gets a good night's sleep on Halloween. Because some traditions, especially the cheap, creepy and communal ones, never really die. Sack races might sound innocent, but not when the sacks are made of rough jute and the finish line is a muddy ditch. It's fun until someone dislocates a shoulder. Victorians called this character building. We call it insurance liability. Let's join the festivities on a brisk Victorian afternoon. The garden is festooned with lanterns and leftover laundry. The children are sugared up on questionable toffees, and the adults have already started wagering on which relative will eat dirt first. In the middle of it all is the centerpiece of the evening's athletic spectacle, the sack race. The rules are simple and brutal. Find the scratchiest, most questionably stained potato sack in the cellar, cram your legs inside, and hop as fast as your dignity allows toward a finish line that, this being Victorian England, is either a mud patch, a shallow puddle, or, if you're especially unlucky, the edge of a goose pen. There are no helmets, no referees, and absolutely no mercy from your fellow racers, who have all developed a sudden appreciation for competitive elbowing. On your mark, get set, go. The shouts of encouragement are quickly drowned out by shrieks, curses, and the sound of small bodies colliding with garden furniture. The jute sack, designed for transporting turnips rather than human legs, immediately begins exfoliating your shins with every jump. You try to maintain balance, but the ground is slick, and the sack is determined to eat your socks. It's not just children who take part. Adults, after a few glasses of festive punch and a round of self-deprecating jokes, are encouraged to join the race. Imagine your uncle, who hasn't run since the Crimean War, bounding heroically before toppling sideways into a clump of nettles. The crowd howls, misses. Weatherby attempts a daring overtake, only to end up face down in the ditch, her bonnet sailing through the air like a startled pheasant. Injuries are a certainty. Bruises bloom, knees are scraped, and the family doctor is pressed into service with a bottle of gin and the Victorian cure-all. Walk it off. A few sprained ankles and a minor head wound are shrugged off as evidence of robust health. After all, in a society where children are expected to sweep chimneys and adults regularly duel with malfunctioning boilers, a sack race injury is just another notch on the bedpost of character development. The finish line is chaos. Cheating is rampant. Someone's always got a sibling yanking them forward by the arm, or an enterprising cousin dumping water over the competition's path. Accusations of foul play are thrown around with the same frequency as mud. The first racer to stagger across the line is crowned champion, at least until it's discovered they've burst through the bottom of their sack and are technically disqualified. But for all the bumps and bruises, the sack race is oddly beloved. There's a sense of accomplishment in surviving the world's most hazardous form of exercise. The losers, meaning everyone, are caked in mud, picking twigs out of their hair, and laughing so hard they almost forget about the nettle rash blooming on their shins. Once the race is over, the sacks are shaken out, sometimes releasing a mouse or two, and everyone limps back to the parlor for hot drinks and tales of past glories. The event becomes legend in family lore. Remember the year Grandpa sprained his ankle in the sack race and blamed it on a passing squirrel? Did you ever get the mud out of your petticoat after that epic slide? So next time someone suggests a fun party game, spare a thought for the Victorians, who believed that nothing built character or provided entertainment, quite like the risk of mild bodily harm. After all, if you haven't done at least one sack race that ended in a mud bath and a scandalized aunt, have you really celebrated Halloween at all? Faking a séance was a classic prank, until someone actually believed you'd summoned Great-Aunt Mildred and demanded you exercise the furniture. Awkward family dinners ensued. Spiritual trauma, free of charge. Let's set the scene. It's Halloween night in a respectable Victorian drawing room. The fire is low, the gas lamps are turned down, and the family has just finished arguing about whether ghosts wear hats. Suddenly, your cousin announces it's time for a séance, a tradition nearly as beloved as overcooked cabbage. Everyone crowds around the table, some giddy, some skeptical, all in various states of readiness to be either amazed or mildly inconvenienced. The medium for the evening, usually the cousin with the most flair for drama or the least scruples, solemnly asks everyone to join hands and close your eyes to the veil. The room goes silent except for the gentle clatter of teaspoons and the faint squeak of someone's corset. Someone begins to hum ominously, and then let the mischief commence. A hidden conspirator tugs a string attached to a painting, making it sway just enough to send Aunt Edith into a fit of righteous anxiety. Someone else lightly kicks the table leg, producing the much-anticipated spirit rapping. A willing accomplice, positioned behind the settee, launches into a moan so theatrical it's somewhere between anguished ghost and cat with indigestion. If things are going well, the family dog joins in, barking at an invisible foe, or at least at Uncle Neville's suspiciously shiny hair pomade. The pinnacle of the prank is the message from beyond. The medium, eyes rolled skyward, declares that Great Aunt Mildred is with you and wants to share important news, like the location of her missing dentures or her strong opinions on this year's rhubarb harvest. For most, it's good for a laugh, especially when someone tries to quiz the ghost with questions only the living would know. But occasionally, someone, usually the most superstitious family member or a recent convert to the Gothic novel, takes things a step further. "I always said that armchair was haunted," whispers Cousin Mabel, clutching her shawl. "She's come back to sit in it, hasn't she? We need to have the vicar over to cleanse the room." Suddenly, the joke has backfired. What began as a bit of fun devolves into a full-blown haunting, complete with salt circles, nervous glances at the wallpaper, and an urgent search for holy water. The family debate spirals. Should the sofa be burned? Does the clock tick a little louder than usual? Has anyone actually seen Aunt Mildred's ghostly bun float past the mantelpiece? If you're lucky, the séance simply leads to a night of restless sleep and vague anxiety. But sometimes the consequences are more dramatic. One household reportedly spent 3 weeks avoiding the parlour, taking tea in the scullery, and gossiping in the coal cellar, all because a prankster couldn't resist adding a blood-curdling woo at just the right moment. In another case, an overzealous séance-goer spent an afternoon attempting to communicate with the spirit of his missing cufflinks, only to be caught talking to the umbrella stand by a very confused housemaid. In the aftermath, families faced a dilemma. Confess and risk the wrath of every elderly relative in attendance, or keep up the charade and hope the haunting lost its novelty. Inevitably, new rules were proposed. No séances after sunset, no string allowed at the dinner table, and under no circumstances was Cousin Bertram to impersonate the dearly departed in the future. Despite the risk of spiritual chaos and more than a few bruised egos, fake séances remained a beloved part of Victorian Halloween mischief. After all, nothing gets the adrenaline going like the threat of supernatural revenge or the prospect of exorcising your grandmother's chaise lounge. In a world where so much was buttoned up, a little spooky silliness provided a welcome break from the ordinary. At least until someone had to explain why the family cat now refused to enter the drawing room. So the next time you hear a creak in the night, remember, it might not be a spirit from beyond. It might just be your cousin, armed with a ball of string, an overactive imagination, and a very questionable sense of humor. Welcome to the world of the Victorian fake séance, where even the ghosts are in on the joke. Who needs subtlety? The Victorian love of loud noises meant Halloween nights rang with firecrackers, starter pistols, and occasionally an actual firearm. Pranks that could deafen you and possibly land you in jail or the hospital. Picture a brisk October evening in 1885. The sun has barely dipped below the factory chimneys when the first bang reverberates through the neighborhood. Birds scatter, dogs howl, and several elderly ladies dropped their knitting in alarm. You might think the town has come under siege, but no, it's just another Victorian Halloween. And someone's favourite tradition is back with a vengeance, making as much noise as humanly or inhumanly possible. It started innocently enough. Firecrackers, imported from China and promptly declared good fun by Victorian thrill seekers, quickly found their place in the seasonal toolkit. But these were not the gentle fizzers of modern garden parties. Victorian firecrackers were more like portable cannons, a small box of black powder wrapped in hope and questionable manufacturing standards. A well-placed cracker could rattle windows, frighten livestock, and send the household cat into therapy. Children, naturally, adored them. They'd save up farthings all year for a handful of these explosive treats, eager to toss them under carriage wheels, into outhouses, or, for the truly brave, at the feet of a passing constable. The bravest, or least sensible, tried to make their own. Local papers regularly published dire warnings about the dangers of homebrew firecrackers, often illustrated by a cartoon boy with bandaged hands and an apologetic expression. But firecrackers were only the beginning. As dusk deepened, the neighborhood chorus was joined by the sharp pop of starter pistols, the whistle of homemade rockets, and, on at least one regrettable occasion, the unmistakable boom of an actual shotgun. Start pistols, meant for races and athletic competitions, became impromptu noisemakers. Every household seemed to have one, tucked away in a drawer for just such an emergency, or in this case, a mischievous holiday. The result was pandemonium. Every few minutes, another sharp retort would echo down the street, followed by peals of laughter, shrieks of surprise, or the stern bellow of an adult who'd just dropped their pudding. Windows shook. Soup was spilled. Respectable fathers leapt behind sofas, convinced the Crimean War had come back for a sequel. Pranksters, of course, revelled in the chaos. Timing was everything. A well-timed firecracker could send a group of guests leaping out of their chairs, or make the local dogs sing an accidental chorus. The more ambitious pranksters set up booby traps that would go off when someone entered a room, sending flour, feathers, or the occasional live frog airborne in a puff of smoke and confusion. No one was truly safe, not even the family parrot, who by the end of the night was demanding "no more bang" in perfect Queen's English. Predictably, there were consequences. Ears rang for days, tempers frayed, and every town had a tale of someone who ended the night at the doctor's with a minor injury and a major lecture. Police issued warnings. Parents made empty threats to ban all explosives forever, and the local vicar led prayers for peace and quieter holidays. Still, year after year, the tradition returned. Proof, perhaps, that nothing says Halloween spirit quite like the sound of everyone briefly losing theirs. For the Victorians, these deafening escapades were more than simple mischief. They were an excuse to break the silence, to let loose, to remind themselves and their neighbours that life wasn't just about rules and respectability. The louder the bang, the bigger the thrill, and the better the story the next morning, unless, of course, your mother found the spent cartridge in her favourite teapot. So next time you jump at the sound of a firework, remember, it could be worse. You could be dodging pistols, black powder, and the occasional airborne poultry in a Victorian drawing room. Now that's what you call making a noise about Halloween. Some pranksters got their comeuppance. The flour sack swindle involved rigging a prank to backfire on its creator, coating them in powder and public embarrassment. Justice was served, Victorian style. Let's be honest, there's nothing quite as satisfying as seeing a smug prankster hoisted by their own petard, or, in this case, dusted by their own flour bomb. In Victorian England, where the line between innocent fun and public menace was thinner than a vicar's patience, it was inevitable that pranksters would start turning their tricks on each other. Thus was born the great flour sack swindle, a meta-prank for the ages, perfectly crafted to punish those who had gotten just a little too clever for their own good. Here's how it worked. It started like any other Halloween night, with a neighborhood full of scheming children and would-be mischief makers, all eager to outdo one another with increasingly elaborate flower-based traps. But the most notorious pranksters, those known for their creativity and a worrying lack of respect for laundry, became marked targets. The rest of the community, weary of cleaning powder off every available surface, conspired to set a trap for the trap setters. The scheme was deceptively simple. While the prankster was busy rigging their masterpiece, say, a flour sack poised to drop on an unsuspecting housemaid or a tripwire connected to a door handle, another, even sneakier group would intercept the setup. They'd adjust the contraption just so, ensuring that the next person to test the trap, usually the original prankster, eager to show off their handiwork, would trigger a blizzard of flour directly onto themselves. The results were predictably glorious. The victim, armed with the self-satisfaction of someone who thinks they've just changed the world, would give a proud tug or step back to admire their work, only to be instantly transformed into a walking sack of self-inflicted shame. Laughter erupted from every shadowy corner, as neighbors, siblings, and even former victims reveled in the rare sight of poetic justice made tangible and extremely dusty. Sometimes, the backfire was even more creative. A prankster might fill a sack with what they believed to be flour, only to discover it was loaded with soot, feathers, or the local baker's stale breadcrumbs. In some towns, rumors swirled of extra-ambitious swindlers who added a pinch of itching powder or a small live frog for good measure. If you thought cleaning up after your own prank was bad, try explaining to your mother why you now resemble a chicken in mid-molt. The best part? The flour sack swindle became its own Halloween tradition, a friendly rivalry, a community sport, and a warning to would-be mischief makers everywhere. There was an art to it. You had to be quick, quiet, and above all, clever enough not to get caught yourself. Some years, the contest became so intense that households posted lookouts and entire families united in defense of their honor and their carpets. Of course, there were always sore losers, pranksters who couldn't handle a taste of their own medicine, but even the most vengeful trickster was usually won over by the spectacle of their own humiliation, joining in the laughter and vowing to up the ante next year. And for everyone else, the joy was in the balance of it all. The universe, briefly restored, as the powdered miscreants slunk home for a long bath and a short reflection on the hazards of hubris. What made the flour sack swindle special was its spirit of communal fun. It wasn't about cruelty or retribution, well, not entirely. It was about reminding everyone that nobody is above the rules of mischief, and that sometimes justice is best served, lightly sifted and airborne. So the next time you see a prank go spectacularly, hilariously wrong, just know you're witnessing a proud tradition the Victorians would approve. After all, nothing says Happy Halloween quite like a prankster in need of a new outfit and a little humility, both liberally dusted in flour. Masks weren't just creepy, they were also suffocating, blinding, and occasionally laced with toxins. Wearing a papier-mâché mask was an act of courage and a respiratory challenge. Social distancing by default. Let's travel back to a Victorian Halloween night, where the most terrifying thing in the room wasn't the ghost story or even the neighbor's pickled eel salad. It was the festive mask strapped tightly to your sweating face. Forget the comfortable, breathable, and mostly non-lethal options of today. Victorian Halloween masks were feats of dubious engineering, part horror show, part chemical experiment, and part endurance test. The making of a mask started with paper, glue, and whatever else could be scavenged from the family desk or the bottom of a flour barrel. Children and adults alike spent hours layering newspapers, cardboard, and the odd bit of curtain fabric, then pasting it all together with a glue concoction that doubled as both adhesive and nasal decongestant. If you were lucky, you escaped with only a headache. If you were unlucky, you spent the night wondering if this was how mummies felt, wrapped up, unable to breathe, and slightly pickled by household chemicals. Breathing was optional. Most masks didn't have air holes. Victorians didn't sweat the details. You'd slip the mask over your face and immediately be greeted by a heady aroma of vinegar, boiled flour paste, and, occasionally, the lingering tang of fish from last week's dinner. Some masks were so thick that by the third hour, condensation would start forming on the inside, giving you a personal rainstorm and a free facial at the same time. Vision was a similar luxury. Eye holes were cut wherever seemed appropriate, meaning ghosts spent the evening bumping into furniture, tripping over carpets, and occasionally tackling the family dog by mistake. For added fun, many masks were painted with homemade pigments, lead white for ghastly pallor, arsenic green for an unearthly glow, and whatever else the local chemist would grudgingly part with. The result? A mask that might give you nightmares, and maybe a mild case of heavy metal poisoning. It wasn't just discomfort you had to worry about. The heat trapped inside could leave you lightheaded and cranky. Masks tied tightly with string often left deep grooves in cheeks, making removing your costume as dramatic as a snake shedding its skin. At least one person per party would have to be cut out of their mask by an impatient relative, who then had to field complaints about ruined hair and mask rash for weeks. Yet, for all the hazards, masks were irresistible. The anonymity was thrilling. Just imagine the possibilities. You could startle your neighbors, sneak extra toffee, or finally say what you thought about the mayor's beard without immediate social consequences. Pranksters used masks as cover to stage surprise scares or to blend in with a parade of similarly disfigured partygoers, all hoping to avoid the infamous Guess Who game and the shame of being recognized by your own aunt. Of course, some revelers got creative, sometimes dangerously so. One ambitious youth tried to attach real candles to the sides of his mask, nearly setting his ears alight. Another slathered his mask in grease paint to achieve the shiny demon look, only to spend the next week scrubbing soot off every surface in the house. Some masks were constructed with long papier-mâché noses or wild, protruding teeth, turning the wearer's journey through doorways into a hazardous adventure. Despite all the risks, there was something magical about a house full of costumed ghouls and goblins, each one sweating and squinting behind their homemade disguise. The discomfort, the claustrophobia, the mild chemical burns, all were badges of honor. You hadn't truly celebrated Halloween until you'd nearly fainted in your own papier-mâché oven, chasing your friends through a foggy garden, eyes watering from both laughter and the side effects of industrial glue. So next time you don a soft, modern mask, spare a sympathetic thought for the Victorian pranksters. For them, social distancing wasn't just a courtesy, it was a necessity. After all, you never knew what was lurking behind those painted faces, except, of course, for the faint whiff of vinegar and just a hint of arsenic green. Why stop at fake ghosts? Some households went full skeleton, hanging bones, real or not, in entryways to spook visitors. Sometimes the skeleton fell at the wrong moment. Sometimes the visitors did. Step into a Victorian home on Halloween night, and you might find yourself face to face with the ultimate statement in spooky decor: the household skeleton. Victorians, never content with half measures, went above and beyond when it came to unnerving their guests. If a turnip lantern or a bedsheet ghost felt too quaint, you could always count on the local prankster to up the ante with a swinging, clacking set of bones ready to greet you with open arms. Or, if you were truly unlucky, to collapse onto your head at the worst possible moment. Where did they get these bones? Well, if you were wealthy or well-connected, you might procure a real medical skeleton, borrowed from a doctor friend or liberated from the local apothecary. More commonly, the resourceful crafted their own from jointed sticks, painted chicken bones, and whatever the butcher was willing to part with after hours. The most ambitious spent weeks whittling away in the shed, assembling life-size horrors out of whatever the garden and the larder provided. It was DIY at its most macabre, because nothing says welcome like a papier-mâché skull mounted over the umbrella stand. The skeleton's placement was everything. A favorite tactic was to hang the bones behind the front door so they would swing out as the next visitor entered. Some pranksters placed them on spring-loaded platforms, rigged to leap forward when a weight was applied to a certain floorboard. Others posed them nonchalantly in armchairs, clutching a tankard or the latest copy of the Illustrated London News, so a guest, settling down to rest, would be startled by the world's worst host. Creative families hung bones from chandeliers, balanced skulls on windowsills, or even trailed a string of vertebrae down the staircase like the world's least comforting garland. Victorian children loved nothing more than waiting in the shadows, breath held, to see the reaction. Would Aunt Clara shriek and drop her basket of muffins? Would the milkman lose his hat? Would the maid faint again? The stakes were high, because if your skeleton prank didn't produce a scream, you had failed your ancestors and would have to resort to the backup plan, usually something involving cold porridge and the dog. Sometimes, however, the pranks went awry. The skeleton would swing too forcefully, smacking an unsuspecting guest square in the nose and prompting a hasty apology and an ice pack fashioned from a bag of frozen peas. In other cases, a poorly secured string would snap, sending the bones tumbling down in a noisy avalanche, only for a horrified uncle to trip and join them on the floor. Arms tangled in femurs and cravats. There are even tales of skeletons accidentally left in place after the party, leading to frantic explanations for confused callers well into November. Of course, it wasn't all chaos. Sometimes the skeleton became a fixture, a quirky mascot for the family, regaled with ribbons at Christmas or given a new hat for the new year. Children whispered secrets to it. Adults used it as a coat rack, and the family dog eyed it warily, convinced it was a very patient burglar. The tradition spoke to something deeper in the Victorian soul, a fascination with death, mixed with a love of spectacle and a streak of irrepressible humor. For a society obsessed with mourning and etiquette, Halloween was the rare chance to laugh in the face of mortality, preferably while scaring the socks off your houseguests. So the next time you see a plastic skeleton grinning from a neighbor's porch, remember its illustrious ancestors, the swinging, creaking, occasionally concussing bone displays of Victorian England. Sometimes the scare got you, sometimes you got the scare, and sometimes you just ended up on the parlor floor, tangled in tibias, wondering if you should have stuck to turnip lanterns after all. Horses were a favorite target for Halloween night mischief. Waking up to find your horse on the roof, or inexplicably dyed blue, was a rite of passage. Apologies were rarely forthcoming, but stories abounded. Let's set the scene. It's dawn after Halloween, and you're standing in your dressing gown, clutching a lukewarm cup of tea and staring in disbelief at your stables. The gate is open. The hay rack is suspiciously empty. Your prized gelding is nowhere in sight, at least not at ground level. As you round the corner, you're greeted by the sight of 4 muddy hooves silhouetted against the chimney pots. Either you've had too much laudanum, or those pranksters from up the lane have struck again. Victorian Halloween wasn't just about frightening your neighbors or staging a haunted privy. For the truly ambitious, nothing said I outsmarted you like relocating someone's horse to a place it absolutely should not be. The more creative the location, the more legendary the prank. Roofs were popular for the adventurous, and frankly strong-backed. But horses were also discovered in parlors, cellars, or tied up neatly outside the greengrocer's, sporting a sign that read, "For sale, only eats turnips." Then there was the art of equine makeover. Dyeing a horse blue, green, or even tartan was the height of Victorian prankster chic. The substances used ranged from harmless beetroot, soot, flour paste, to less harmless, indigo dye, lamp black, mysterious concoctions best left undocumented. The poor animal might spend days sporting garish polka dots or a fetching set of painted eyebrows, depending on the household's creative flair and disregard for both property and livestock law. But why horses? Well, a horse was often the most valuable thing a Victorian owned. Stealing one was serious business, unless it was Halloween, in which case the law temporarily looked the other way, provided the animal was returned, more or less intact, by breakfast. For pranksters, horses were the perfect canvas. Large, mobile, and usually far too dignified to lower themselves to human nonsense. For the victims, it was a test of patience, humor, and one's ability to scrub indigo out of horsehair. Sometimes, the prank involved a coordinated effort. Gangs of local youths would plot for weeks, watching for the right moment to liberate the baker's cart horse or the parson's pony. Ropes, ramps, and more than a little bribery, usually apples, were employed to persuade the animal to go where no horse had gone before. Success meant glory. Failure meant a frantic dash through the fields, pursued by a red-faced owner and a chorus of unsympathetic crows. The aftermath of these escapades was legendary. Owners would storm the lanes, demanding justice, only to be met with shrugs and thinly veiled smirks. Children pleaded ignorance. Adults offered to help look, while suppressing laughter. And the local blacksmith became an overnight celebrity for his horse-wrangling skills. Some horses developed reputations as accomplices, known to go along with the pranks in exchange for extra oats, or, perhaps, just for the attention. Inevitably, not every horse found its way home in pristine condition. There were tales of muddy hooves on freshly waxed floors, hoofprints across thatched roofs, and a pony named Daisy who wandered into a wedding reception and ate half the cake before being discovered. Every incident became a story, retold and embellished at every harvest supper and Christmas gathering, until the truth was little more than a faint whinny on the autumn wind. But for all the inconvenience, the vanishing horse was part of the wild spirit of Victorian Halloween. It was a night when even the most staid members of the community were reminded not to take themselves too seriously, and when four-legged friends became unwilling celebrities in the season's greatest spectacle. So, next time you misplace your keys or your neighbor borrows your lawn gnome, take comfort. At least you don't have to get your horse off the roof. In Victorian England, that was just another Halloween to remember. Not every Halloween prank ended in laughter. In a world of open flames, black powder, and casual disregard for safety, some tricks went sideways, leading to real injuries, scandal, and the occasional inquest. Spoiler. Victorian newspapers loved these stories. Let's step away from the pie-in-the-face jollity and peer into the shadowy side of Victorian mischief. For all their creativity, the pranksters of the era often played with fire, sometimes literally. The same holiday that gave us wax apples and bedsheet ghosts also gave rise to some truly hair-raising and hair-singeing disasters. The trouble started with the materials. Imagine a house stuffed with velvet drapes, oil lamps flickering on every surface, and Halloween costumes built from dry straw and flammable rags. Add in a healthy dose of overconfidence, and you have a recipe for disaster. There are documented cases of costumed revelers catching fire while attempting a dramatic entrance by candlelight. Nothing kills the mood like the smell of singed linen and the rapid deployment of a punch bowl as a fire extinguisher. Then there was the black powder. Victorians adored a good bang, firecrackers, makeshift cannons, even small gunpowder bombs designed to frighten the life out of neighbors. The instructions were vague at best. Mix until it looks right. And supervision was practically non-existent. Unsurprisingly, accidents abounded. Stories circulated of would-be pranksters blowing out windows, scorching eyebrows, or, in the worst cases, suffering lasting injury. The sound of an unexpected explosion might signal a successful joke or a panicked rush to summon the town doctor. not even the animal antics were always safe. Mischief makers occasionally tried to corral less than domesticated livestock, angry goats, spirited ponies, or a flock of geese with a deep-seated grudge against humanity. An ill-planned prank involving a stubborn cow or startled pig could lead to trampled toes, broken furniture, and lifelong suspicion between neighbors. And if you thought a goose in your parlor was funny, try explaining to the magistrate why your prank ended in a broken window and a police report. Worse still were the pranks that crossed the line from shocking to scandalous. Sometimes, what began as a harmless coffin prank ended up traumatizing the wrong household, especially if an elderly resident or sick child was involved. The newspapers, never ones to shy away from drama, pounced on these incidents with glee. Headlines like Mischief Night Mayhem, Boy Nearly Smothered by Flower Bomb or Parlor Inferno, Halloween Joke Ends in Flames became autumnal staples, each story more lurid and finger-wagging than the last. An inquest was the ultimate buzzkill. Towns assembled solemnly to determine how a prank had ended so poorly and what ought to be done about it. Testimonies ranged from heartfelt regret to thinly veiled boasts. Well, it did seem a bit much, but the goat had it coming. Occasionally, pranks inspired real change. Bans on certain types of firecrackers, warnings against storing oil lamps near party games, or stern lectures from the vicar about the dangers of tempting fate and the fire brigade. For many families, a Halloween mishap became a cautionary tale, repeated with growing drama at every gathering. Remember the year Uncle Reggie tried to scare Mrs. Perkins with the exploding cabbage? We nearly lost the front porch. Lessons were learned, mostly about the importance of having a good insurance policy and never, ever letting Cousin Harold near anything with a fuse. Yet, in true Victorian fashion, the appetite for danger never quite faded. Even after a tragedy, next year's pranks would return, perhaps a bit tamer, perhaps not. There was a strange resilience, a determination to find laughter even after a fright. Perhaps it was a way to cope with a world already full of risks, disease, accidents, the mysterious perils of Victorian cuisine. So, as you watch modern Halloween mischief unfold, safe, regulated, and rarely involving livestock, spare a moment for the pranksters of the past. Their jokes didn't always end well, but they lived, and sometimes limped, in a time when trick or treat was less question and more a dare. And sometimes, the greatest trick was simply making it to the next morning in one piece. The sun rises over a city littered with flour, feathers, and bewildered livestock. The Victorian response? Blame the Irish, vow never to celebrate Halloween again, and secretly start plotting next year's mischief. Some traditions never die, they just get weirder. As the first rays of sunlight cut through the smog and fog, Londoners, Liverpudlians and villagers alike emerge from their homes like survivors of a particularly chaotic dream. The streets look like the aftermath of a pottery auction held during a snowstorm. White drifts of flour coat every stoop. Feathers cling to window panes. And somewhere in the distance, a goat in a top hat is eating someone's laundry. Milkmaids stumble past overturned wheelbarrows, gentlemen grumble about missing hats, and children, disheveled and sugar-crusted, swap stories about last night's legendary exploits. If you're lucky, your only job is to sweep the flour off the steps and chase a rooster out of your garden. More likely, you'll find your outhouse door tied shut, a garden gate wedged in the chimney, and a note tucked in your mailbox reading, "Better luck next year." Housewives sigh as they try to remove egg yolk from lace curtains, and the more respectable gentlemen, determined to preserve their dignity, carry on as if the stuffed turnip in their hat box was always meant to be there. But before anyone actually gets down to scrubbing, there's the Victorian morning ritual, assigning blame. Popular targets include rowdy lads, the Irish, or that mysterious gentleman with a limp and a fondness for turnips. Editorials appear in the local paper decrying the decline of morals and demanding stricter oversight of holiday frolics. The The vicar gives an extra long sermon, urging the town to remember the true meaning of All Hallows' Eve, as if anyone heard him over the sound of livestock being herded off the parish lawn. Meanwhile, the true mischief makers gather in dark corners, or more likely behind the stables, congratulating one another on the previous night's success. There's an air of pride mixed with the occasional sheepish apology. "Sorry about your boots, Mrs. Hargreaves. That goat was more ambitious than anticipated. Plans for next year are already afoot. New tricks, bigger flower bombs, and perhaps a way to get Old Man Wither's horse into the schoolhouse without quite so much property damage. The cleanup is a community affair. Neighbors who spent the night tormenting each other now trade brooms, soap, and the odd cup of strong tea. Children are conscripted into finding every last chicken, duck, and, in one case, an unusually surly pig still at large in the vicar's garden. The local constable, having survived another night with his whistle intact, takes notes on whose windows survived and who's now missing a weather vane. There's also a round of cover-ups. Denial is the first order of business. "That wasn't my boy who tied your cart to the lamppost. He was home all night, wasn't he?" But underneath the righteous indignation and claims of innocence, there's a certain glint in everyone's eye. The truth is, the chaos is half the fun. The aftermath is a badge of honor. For every mother sighing over a ruined rug, there's a father secretly proud his daughter masterminded the best haunted privy in town. As the day wears on, life returns to its normal Victorian rhythms. Laundry, church, gossip. The only evidence of last night's revelry are a few feathers drifting down the street, a faint dusting of flour that refuses to be swept, and the persistent rumor that Mrs. Peel's cat is still wearing a papier-mâché mask somewhere near the docks. Yet, even as the townsfolk vow never again, you can sense the anticipation building. Halloween may be over, but the planning for next year has already begun. Pranks will be refined, strategies whispered behind hands, and everyone will look over their shoulder come next October. Because in the Victorian world, mischief isn't just an event. It's an annual art form, perfected in the daylight, plotted in the shadows, and celebrated in every broom-swept street. So if you ever wonder where our modern love for Halloween chaos comes from, just picture those flower-caked, grinning Victorians, brooms in hand, goats on the loose, and a twinkle in their eyes, ready to do it all over again. Some things never really get cleaned up. They just become tradition. Halloween night meant the return of the mummers, a troupe of semi-voluntary actors who roamed the streets in tatty costumes, banging pots and demanding an audience for their bizarre, barely rehearsed plays. Imagine being jolted awake by a pack of amateur thespians chanting nonsense outside your window at midnight. The real terror? If you didn't pay up, you might get dragged into the performance. Nothing ruins your sleep schedule like being forcibly cast as the corpse in a local rendition of Hamlet. Let's set the stage. You're tucked into bed, the last embers in the grate flickering, when suddenly your street erupts in chaotic noise, shouts, laughter, the unmistakable clanging of kitchenware repurposed as percussion. Before you can pull the blankets over your ears, a mob of mummers appears, their costumes a glorious mess of patched cloaks, old curtains, and the occasional cabbage leaf hat. They are here for one reason, to perform. Or, failing that, to make sure nobody else sleeps until they've at least had a look at old Tom in a wig, reciting lines from memory and invention in equal measure. Mumming was an old tradition, dragged out of obscurity every Halloween with all the subtlety of a brass band on a tea break. The performances ranged from half-remembered folk tales to wild improvisations. Sometimes there was a script, usually lost within minutes, or just a vague idea that someone should be king, another hero, and at least one poor soul the corpse. If the audience was lucky, the play featured slapstick sword fights and comic misunderstandings. If unlucky, it ran so long that people started to envy the corpse's early exit. But the true genius of mummers was their commitment to breaking the fourth wall. If you peered out the window to shush them, you risked being chosen as the villain, the monster, or the inexplicably dancing goat. Refuse to toss a few coins or an apple into the hat. And suddenly you were on stage, handed a prop, usually a mop or a loaf of stale bread, and expected to deliver your best death scene. The audience, meanwhile, was a shifting crowd of sleepy townsfolk, gleeful children, and at least one dog convinced it was about to make its theatrical debut. Mummers weren't above a little extortion either. Their cries of penny for the play, misses, soon gave way to a show of stubborn persistence. They'd perform and re-perform until they'd wrung a few pence or last year's mince pie from every house on the street. The brave, or foolish, who tried to ignore them, risked seeing their doorknobs soaped, their windows painted with chalk, or their privy immortalized in song. The costumes added to the fever dream. One mummer might be decked out in what used to be a curtain, now embroidered with dubious stains. Another wore a mask fashioned from a flour sack, painted with soot and more enthusiasm than talent. If anyone owned an actual theatrical prop, it was inevitably lost, replaced by whatever could be borrowed, stolen, or hastily constructed out of an old shoe and some string. The visual effect was part panto, part apocalypse. Despite the noise, the late hour, and the distinct risk of being pulled half-dressed onto your own front step, the arrival of the mummers was a highlight of the Halloween season. Townsfolk laughed, groaned, and secretly hoped they wouldn't be the next volunteer. Children practiced their stage screams, aspiring to join the troupe when they were older. Even the most sleep-deprived neighbor had to admit that nothing brought a street together quite like a midnight performance, especially when you could bribe your way out with a penny and a spare scone. So the next time you grumble about carolers or street musicians, remember the mummers, Victorian England's answer to midnight entertainment and neighborhood anarchy. At least you can be sure you'll never wake up to find yourself reciting Shakespeare to an audience of chickens in your nightshirt unless, of course, Halloween comes calling. Victorian pranksters had a passion for science, by which I mean anything that smoked, sparked, or produced alarming odors. From sneaking into gardens to set up phantom fires with sulfur powder to deploying homemade smoke bombs in drawing rooms, the only limit was the household's tolerance for chaos. If you've ever tried to microwave fish in an office, you already understand Victorian chemistry experiments gone wrong. Let's step into a Victorian Halloween laboratory, otherwise known as your cousin's shed, crammed with empty bottles, suspicious powders, and the kind of optimism only a person with very little self-preservation can muster. The Victorians may not have had YouTube tutorials, but they had something even more dangerous: curiosity and a complete lack of fire codes. With a few shillings worth of chemicals from the apothecary and a stack of dog-eared science manuals, the night's budding mad scientist could transform a sleepy street into a living demonstration of chaos theory. The main ingredients were simple and universally alarming. Sulfur powder was a favorite. Just the right amount would produce a noxious cloud thick enough to convince the neighbors their garden was being haunted by the ghost of Guy Fawkes. If you wanted to spice things up, you might add a little saltpeter for that dramatic whiff of brimstone. Some pranksters favored the slow burn approach, a hidden pan of smoldering rags, wafting smoke through keyholes and under doors until the whole household was coughing, shrieking, and hunting desperately for a bucket. But why stop at smoke? The true connoisseur of spookiness understood the value of mirrors and reflective surfaces. With a well-placed looking glass in a dark hallway, you could convince the most rational family member that they'd glimpsed a spectre drifting behind them. Enterprising pranksters strung wires to tug at curtains, swung lanterns to cast ghostly shapes on the walls, or even rigged up phantom hands made of gloves stuffed with flour, ready to drop from the ceiling at just the right moment. For indoor festivities, the show often reached its peak with the infamous smoke bomb. Recipes were traded in whispers, a pinch of sugar, a dollop of nitrate, and a sturdy sense of denial. The resulting explosion of white or coloured smoke was dramatic enough to transform a genteel drawing room into a scene of total confusion. Servants would dash about, fanning windows, while guests coughed and argued over whose fault it was that the punch now tasted faintly of potassium. In the aftermath, there was always at least one scorched rug, a sooty mantelpiece, and a stern note from the housekeeper demanding hazard pay. And then there were the smells. Not content with mere visual effects, some pranksters dabbled in olfactory warfare, burning feathers, rotten eggs, or, most dreaded of all, a chunk of Limburger cheese hidden behind the drapes. If you could stink up the house for a week, you were a legend. The truly mischievous snuck scented concoctions into coat pockets, or left a trail of smouldering herbs to lure superstitious relatives into searching for the source of the miasma. Of course, it wasn't just the young and foolish who got involved. Elderly uncles who'd survived Napoleonic wars were eager to demonstrate how we used to signal across enemy lines, sometimes with the unfortunate result of setting the garden fence on fire. Local apothecaries sold scientific amusements with the vague warning, "Use in well-ventilated areas," which every Victorian promptly ignored. The evening was not complete without at least one visit from the neighbourhood constable, shaking his head at the latest smoky outrage. Yet, despite the risks, scorched wallpaper, offended noses, and the occasional small explosion, there was something thrilling in the chaos. For one night, the boundaries between science and sorcery blurred, and everyone could join in the spectacle. The more inventive the prank, the bigger the legend. Stories of haunted smoke, ghostly reflections, and that one year when the mayor's wig caught fire were retold with relish for years to come. So the next time you wonder why your smoke alarm is so touchy, remember the Victorians. Their experiments might have been hazardous, but they sure knew how to keep Halloween interesting. If your house still smells faintly of sulphur and mischief, you're doing it right. You haven't experienced home decor until you've tried to scrub egg white and fake cobwebs out of a Victorian chandelier. Pranksters took great pride in transforming respectable parlours into gothic nightmares, deploying sticky webs, molasses traps, and even buckets of goose feathers from the upper landing. The real horror was the cleanup, which usually fell on someone who'd spent the entire party trying to keep the dog off the trifle. Let's step into the heart of a Victorian drawing room on Halloween night. Walls lined with wallpaper so busy it could hide a family of mice, and a carpet so thick it doubled as an ankle trap. But tonight, all of it is covered with an extra, uninvited layer. Cobwebs. Not the delicate, natural kind spun by a lone, industrious spider. No, these are the handiwork of pranksters, armed with sticky egg whites, strands of boiled sugar, and an attitude that can only be described as chaotic creative. The cobweb cannon was a term lovingly bestowed upon any device or person capable of launching sticky threads across a room. Some Victorian mischief makers rigged up bellows to spray egg whites through a sieve, while others, less mechanically inclined, simply dipped their hands in goo and flung it with the enthusiasm of a child let loose in the pantry. The results were spectacular. Ceilings dripped with cobwebs, candlesticks acquired strange, glistening halos, and anyone tall enough to walk upright risked getting a hairful of the night's festive decor. But why stop with webs? No Gothic transformation was complete without the judicious use of feathers. Buckets of goose down, collected from a season's worth of pillow plundering, were stationed atop doors, ready to be released on the next unsuspecting guest. If you've never watched a parade of proper Victorians transformed into squawking, feathered phantoms, you've never truly understood Halloween. Even the family dog, with a fresh plume stuck to its nose, was not immune from the chaos. For those who craved a bit of slapstick, there were molasses traps, shallow pans placed strategically on the floor, or a subtle trail leading from the hallway to the parlour. One sticky misstep, and the poor victim was caught, literally red-handed, with a sweet and very difficult to remove reminder of the evening's festivities. If you managed to avoid the molasses, you might still be snared by flower bombs hidden behind the curtains, or fall prey to a creeping vine of sticky twine, rigged to wrap around ankles and send guests tumbling with a howl. As the night wore on, the line between prankster and victim blurred. What began as an organized attempt to spook up the house quickly devolved into an all-out battle. Cobwebs flew, feathers floated, and more than one child attempted to fashion a makeshift wig from the chaos. The servants, resigned to their fate, took bets on which guest would cry enough and retreat first to the relative safety of the cellar. The aftermath was always a sight. Chandeliers drooped with sugar strings, sideboards glistened with half-dried egg, and the sofa bore mysterious stains that would become the stuff of legend. The next morning was a testament to Victorian endurance. Hours spent scrubbing, picking feathers from the butter dish, and trying, usually in vain, to convince the dog to give up the remnants of a sticky top hat. Yet, for all the mess and mayhem, the cobweb cannon was adored. The more elaborate the decorations, the prouder the hosts, who would regale guests all year with tales of that night we nearly suffocated Lord Beasley in a feather storm. Halloween was, after all, the one night when even the sternest matron could laugh at herself, especially while untangling a strand of sticky sugar from her spectacles. So next time you find yourself fussing over Halloween decorations, remember, nothing you buy in a shop can match the raw, chaotic, and thoroughly sticky creativity of a Victorian cobweb cannon. And if you do happen to get egg white in your hair, or feathers in your tea, just smile. You're keeping the tradition alive, one chandelier at a time. So as you settle in for sleep, let's reflect on what we've just survived together. A Victorian Halloween, equal parts ridiculous, dangerous, and somehow deeply relatable. Tonight you dodged flower bombs, nearly drowned in an apple-bobbing bucket, avoided haunted outhouses, and endured the wild ambitions of pranksters armed with turnips and an almost supernatural disregard for public safety. In a single evening you witnessed ghostly seances, fake corpses, and the sort of postal shenanigans that would make your local mail carrier file for hazard pay. It's easy to laugh at the chaos, but under all the soot, feathers, and ill-advised pyrotechnics, there's something quietly impressive about those Victorians. They were experts at turning boredom into art, mischief into social commentary, and the simple act of surviving another foggy autumn into an endurance sport. They coped with their world, one full of early bedtimes, haunted plumbing, and mysterious stains